AI scanners just swept beneath the Temple Mount and found hidden rooms that don't appear on any map. The images show straight walls, sealed doorways, and hollow spaces carved into bedrock where no one is allowed to dig. Ground-penetrating radar traced the edges of a perfect circle with a narrow entry, water channels that branch like a planned system, and corridors that connect voids in ways that only builders would design. The scans were done without moving a single stone, because excavation here is forbidden by every group that guards the hill. So what's inside that sealed chamber? How did ancient builders carve a water system this precise beneath sacred ground? And what happens when the first line of writing comes into focus without anyone ever opening the door? The line "No one crosses the Temple Mount" sits at the living center of Jerusalem with stone that has carried prayers and rulings and grief and hope for longer than any one story can hold, and every faith that gathers there guards the meaning of each doorway and each pavement because a change on this hill can move crowds across the world, which is why excavation is not allowed and why even a simple repair is watched from many sides. Muslims hold the site as Haram al-Sharif and preserve the sanctuaries that shine from its heights. Jews face the wall that remains and speak of a house that once stood above it. Christians trace the streets that run outward from the hill and follow a path of memory through markets and gates. And all of them measure words when the mount is named because one sentence can warm hearts or tighten fists depending on how it is heard. Rules are not only laws here, they are promises that keep a fragile calm. So research must stay outside the fences that mark the platform, and even a careful hand is not welcome if it means shifting one stone from its place. The first maps of the underworld of Jerusalem were drawn in lamplight by surveyors who crawled through water channels and climbed vertical cuts with ropes and marked the place where bedrock meets construction with ink that still looks fresh in leather-bound books. And those sheets carry names like the shaft that keeps Warren's memory alive and the galleries that kept a city supplied in siege and heat. Yet for all that effort the great flat crown stayed quiet because a line had been drawn and every group that held the keys refused to let curious hands cross it. You could measure flows in the lower tunnels and you could breathe the cold air where springs once ran, you could log the height of the retaining walls that hold the platform's weight, but you could not lift a flagstone inside the enclosure or open a plug in a corridor that the guardians consider their trust to keep sealed. The question that sits beneath the courtyard is the same one that pulled explorers to the edges in every century, which is whether the plan of the ancient complex is still written into the bedrock and whether traces of rooms and passages remain intact behind closures that have not moved in living memory, and if that answer is yes, then what kind of proof can be shared without opening a single joint? If the only honest path is to look from a distance, can distance still offer the detail that turns debate into knowledge, and can a city that has argued for so long accept a picture that arrives as data instead of dust? If the ground is ready to speak in reflections and returns rather than in fragments and shards, will people listen with the same respect they give to a stone in the hand? If a handful of dirt could change the debate once before, what could careful signals from beneath the surface do now? The sift that changed minds long before trained models and dense point clouds entered the story. A cascade of soil rolled off the hill and into the valley, and with it rolled centuries of small objects that should have been catalogued where they lay. And the sight of trucks tipping earth into a slope was a shock to scholars who knew that a shard the size of a fingernail can carry a date and a context that no paragraph can replace once it is lost. Two archaeologists looked at the mound of mixed soil and decided that if the hill could not be opened, then the debris itself would become the field. So they moved the earth to a place where the public could wash it and look through it and log every piece with patient hands, and in that park families stood over screens and rinsed the dust from slivers of pottery and beads and coins while staff recorded every find, and together they turned what looked like waste into a record that could be studied and shared. The sifting recovered lamps that fit known time frames and tiny seals that carried names from lines that people have read for centuries. It brought up handles with stamps that mark a trade and a workplace. It found a comb with letters that show how early writing sounded when it spoke of a daily annoyance that still makes people smile, and the steady work taught a lesson that calm minds have repeated ever since, which is that method matters more than access when a site is sensitive. Rather than force a trench where none is allowed, the project showed a way to listen to the hill without wounding it, and that example softened some fears because it proved that the story could grow while the surface remained untouched. What the sifting did for the debate was to show that even a strict rule can yield knowledge if you are patient and creative and ready to invite the public into the work. And that shifted how many people saw the task because it turned the mount from a locked room into a library where the checkout desk sits under the sky, and the city learned that ordinary hands can rescue a past that seemed reach. When people saw that a careful plan could gather truth without a single bruise to the platform, they became more willing to hear about other tools that could do the same, and that openness cleared a path for scanners to move where cameras and shovels cannot. By the time the idea of a coordinated scan took shape, there was a model for partnership because the sifting had shown that openness calms nerves and that logs and tags and public reports build trust. So the radar work and the optical work began with memoranda that spelled out what would not be done as clearly as what would be done, and that clarity mattered as much as any instrument. If a pile of soil could give back names from priestly families and letters that show how people spoke about small life in a very old city, what might a field of echoes give back from sealed spaces that no one will open? If the hill answered once through rescued soil, what happens when it answers through waves that pass and return without leaving a mark? The scan that sees through stone works by sending pulses into the surface and listening for the echoes as they bounce from layers and objects, and when those echoes are stacked and filtered and corrected for moisture and temperature and material, they turn into images that look like shades of gray slicing through a volume. And if you collect enough slices, you can recombine them into three-dimensional shapes that let you walk a line through the past without moving a pebble. The challenge in an old city is noise because pipes and vaults and repairs can confuse the signal, which is why the teams began by tying their frames to historic grids and to utility plans and to surveys that show where modern work leaves shadows, and then they moved at a measured pace and kept notes as careful as any excavation log. From a span of seasons beginning in one year and running through the next, people who knew how to carry equipment in tight lanes and quiet courtyards traced legal paths along the edges of the compound and through terraces that offer safe access, and they turned hours of careful walking into dense fields of returns that could be stitched to the mandate-era sheets and to modern control points. When the composite view settled, it did not show a random scatter of holes or a meaningless fog, it showed straight lines where straight lines should not be natural and angles that repeat with purpose, and thin corridors that link one void to another in a logic that a builder would understand. In the southern sector, a smooth circle began to appear behind a short neck of solid signal that reads like a sealed entry, and the floor reads as level and the wall reads as continuous, and the diameter repeats within a tight range from pass to pass, which is how you know you are not chasing a ghost of processing, and the model ranks it as highly intentional because nature does not cut perfect rings into this bedrock at that depth. Other features align with the needs of a functioning sacred precinct because the water lines read as a web that feeds points where cleansing would matter and the broader voids sit where gathering would have meaning, and some shallow corridors curve away into older cuts where earlier builders left their signs. The most careful phase comes after the thrill because the teams run the harshest filters to see what survives, and they ask outside readers to try to break the interpretation before a single sentence leaves the room. And in this case the circle and the corridors and the water plan continue to hold through all of those tests, which is rare enough to deserve the world's attention. If a chamber with one approach sits under the paving and still holds objects that answer with the density of stone and clay shaped by human hands, then it would be a disservice to the city to look away simply because the room is off limits. If the images sketch a plan, what do the layers beneath the plan say about when and why it was made? Layers that do not lie. Every site in Jerusalem tells its story in layers, and the Mount is no different. So the honest way to move from a picture to a claim is to place the features that the algorithms find against the long sequence of building that scholars already hold in mind, and then to test whether the shape fits a known phase or forces an addition to the chart. In places where the surface record shows chapels from the Byzantine years, the subsurface still carries heavier blocks with tooling that belongs to an earlier hand, and where later work rests upon that mass, you can read how new faiths placed their marks on old foundations without scraping away what came before, which is how sacred ground tends to grow when many communities keep it alive. The water system that shows in the scans is not casual or convenient, it is deliberate and broad and arranged as if priests needed an assured flow for washing and for vessels and for the work of sacrifice, and the lines that feed the reservoirs lean toward the places where worshippers would enter and leave, which gives the plan a rhythm that fits descriptions that people have read for generations. When mineral samples from legal apertures in nearby cuts are dated, they fall where a reader of history would expect them to fall. Like and subscribe if you want to follow the next.